The NBER was originally put together and organized to construct objective facts about the economy, and the key figures in the founding were Malcolm Rorty and Nahum Stone. These were men, as Jim discussed, that had very different views about policy, and they deliberately put together a group of people from different schools of thought, from the extreme conservative to the extreme radical, so as to be able to produce a set of facts that were considered scientifically produced, impartial, and nonpartisan. The original projects are the projects that have already been discussed in the first two papers. The initial project was a project on national income, which eventually led to the creation of the national income and product accounts. And then in the first quarter century, the NBER also did very important work on business cycles. Now, in these first 25 years, the contribution of the NBER to monetary economics was relatively modest. And the focus of my remarks are going to be about the contribution to monetary economics. So I'm going to move on to kind of the second 25 years of the Bureau's history. Now, the singular contribution of the NBER to monetary economics is the project on money and banking that was headed by Milton Friedman in close collaboration with Anna Schwartz for a number of decades, starting in 1948. But if I let myself define monetary economics slightly broadly to include the development of Keynesian macroeconomics, I think there's one other very important contribution to monetary economics that needs to be discussed even in a very short discussion like this that's only 20 minutes, and that is the development of the permanent income hypothesis by Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman's book, A Theory of the Consumption Function, was published by the NBER in 1957, which is of course well known, but it's perhaps not quite as well remembered that a lot of the motivating facts that led to the development of the permanent income hypothesis were also largely done at the NBER or published by the NBER. So you may not remember, but both Franco Modigliani and Milton Friedman cite three seminal contributions, empirical papers basically, that they think of as having led to the development of the permanent income hypothesis on the one hand and the life cycle model on the other hand. And these three empirical papers are Simon Kuznets's 1946 book using the estimates from the national income and product counts back to 1899 to analyze various questions. And one of the results that Kuznets comes to in that book is that there has not been a secular increase in the savings rate over those half a century. Now, if you remember, at the time, Keynes had formulated a consumption function, and one of the main features of this consumption function was a marginal propensity to consume that was less than 1. And people at the time believed that this implied that we should see a secular increase in savings over time as income grew. And people were very scared of this because they thought that savings would outpace our ability to invest, and eventually we would get into secular stagnation. So Simon Kuznets's result in that book was, kind of an important result undermining the leading interpretation of Keynes's consumption function at the time. The second study is a paper by Dorothy Brady and Rose Friedman in 1947 that's also published by the NBER. In this paper, they reanalyzed budget studies that were used at the time to estimate consumption functions, and they found that when they estimated consumption functions over time, these consumption functions shifted up as the economy grew. And so this basically was micro-evidence that made sense of, as Kuznets's result, that this aggregate savings rate was not rising over time, and it again was undermining the leading interpretation of the Keynesian consumption function. The third study that is mentioned by Modigliani and Friedman is a study by Margaret Reed, which is unpublished, and this is, they say, the first study that introduces the concept of permanent income. So two of these three studies were published by the NBER and to some extent were done in the NBER, so I think it's fair to say that the NBER played an important role in the development of the permanent income hypothesis. Now, back to Friedman and Schwartz's project within the NBER on money and banking. So Milton Friedman takes over this project in 1948 and starts working closely with Anna Schwartz, who had been working on this project since the early 40s. Now, the original goal of the project was, on the one hand, to construct reliable data series on the money supply back to the Civil War and to the present. Now, at the time, there was a lot of controversy about how you define money and so on. So they have various measures of money that they're setting out to measure. And in addition to that, they're interested in measuring lending and investment activity in the banking system. Now, so one of the big goals of the project is data construction. And there's a sense in which they're trying to do for money in banking what the NBER had already done for national income before that. Now, there's a second part of the project, which is that they're going to use this new data to think about the causal effect of money and monetary policy on outcome. So that's something that is, in addition to just the data construction. Now, this project originally was supposed to just take 3 years. As they started working on it, the project grew and grew and grew, and eventually took several decades. The major outputs from the project, the biggest outputs are these 4 books, 3 of which are by Friedman and Schwartz. So there's the Monetary History of the United States, published in 1963, the Monetary Statistics of the United States, published in 1970, and Monetary Trends in the United States and the United Kingdom, published in 1982. In addition to that, another major book that came out of this is Philip Kagan's book, Determinants of the Effects of the Change in the Stock of Money, which is published in 1965. In addition to this, a bunch of other smaller articles, in particular a very important paper by Friedman and Schwartz in 1963 on money and the business cycle, are outcomes that come out of this project. Now, obviously, the most influential single piece of work coming out of this project is the monetary history. But I want to start by talking a little bit about the monetary statistics before I turn to the monetary history. So the monetary statistics, in the words of Friedman and Schwartz, was first into draft but later into print. So they started by constructing the statistics. And these statistics, so this book is basically reporting all the details of how they come up with these statistics. And this is basically the foundation for all the rest of the work in the project. So it's a very important piece of work. This is a book that largely settles debates that had been going on for a very long time about the definition of money. So basically after this book, the definition of money is pretty settled. They introduce the modern language of M1 and M2, and they present estimates of M1 and M2, in the case of M2 back to the Civil War, in the case of M1 back to the founding of the Fed, and also compile a bunch of other monetary aggregates and estimates of the money supply that have been constructed by other people back to the founding of the Republic. So it's a major piece of empirical work that the monetary statistics are, and it's the foundation of the rest of the project. However, it's the monetary history that's the most influential piece of work. This is a watershed. The publication of the monetary history is a watershed moment in economics. Its influence in macroeconomics is immense. It's actually so immense that it's kind of hard to describe because all kinds of words like Keynesian meant very different things before the publication of the monetary history. And the monetary history played a very big role in changing the way we think about so many things that when you read this stuff back 50 years ago, it's very confusing because they're using words in really weird ways from a modern point of view, like the word Keynesian. So the basic argument in the monetary history is a very simple one. It's that money and monetary policy are an important contributor to inflation and business cycles. And from a modern point of view, this is a super uncontroversial thesis. It's like, duh, yeah. But at the time, this was a radical view. There was a dissenting view from the prevailing Keynesian thinking at the time that this was not the case. Now, as I said, today in the post-monetary history, post-Volcker disinflation world, it's universally accepted within academia that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, to use a phrase that Milton Friedman popularized in other writing. But, a lot of you that are young in the crowd might not remember that in the pre-monetary history and pre-Volcker United States, the prevailing view in academia was that this was not the case, that actually monetary policy was not effective, not important for business cycles, and not effective at managing aggregate demand and managing inflation, and that inflation should be managed using fiscal policy or price controls or wage controls or such things. Now, it's important to keep in mind that even though this is what's called the Keynesian view, this view was not held by Keynes before he died, and it was also not held by the Federal Reserve in the 1950s, as David and Chrissy Romer have discussed in their work. Now, the basis for this view of the Keynesians in the 1950s that money didn't matter was partly theoretical and partly empirical. So they thought of interest rates as the main transmission mechanism of monetary policy, and Keynes had basically downplayed the importance of interest rates for consumption, and then there were estimates at the time that seemed to suggest that investment was also not very responsive to interest rates. So it looks like things are not very responsive to interest rates, so it can't be that money matters. So that's one kind of pillar of this view. Another pillar of this view was that in the Great Depression, interest rates were very low. So it must have been that money was very easy during the Great Depression, and yet the economy collapsed. So then monetary policy can't be very important. And a third pillar of this view, as far as I can tell, is the fact that from a theoretical point of view in a Keynesian model, if you're in a liquidity trap where interest rates are very, very low, then changes in the money supply have small effects on interest rates. So money is kind of ineffective at changing interest rates. Now interest rates don't affect output very much, so you're doubly in a situation where money doesn't matter. And it was the case from 1930 to 1951 that interest rates were pegged at a very low level. So you were in this setting where, according to the model, monetary policy was not very important. Now, Friedman and Schwartz challenged this view that money doesn't matter in the monetary history. They do this in several ways. So one of the things they do in the book is to document that all post-Civil War downturns were preceded by monetary contractions. And in particular, the Great Depression saw a monetary contraction that was enormous, a 35% collapse in the money supply. So this, in a sense, presents a different view of whether monetary policy was easy or tight. It seemed from this point of view that monetary policy was quite tight during the Great Contraction, which is what they called it. Now, the lasting influence, I think, of the monetary history is not this timing argument. It's more the arguments that they make about causation running from money to output. Okay, and that's a much more complicated set of arguments than the timing arguments. Now, the way in which they make these arguments is informal. It uses a narrative approach, but if you view what they're doing from a modern point of view and use the modern language, what they seem to be doing is trying to identify exogenous monetary policy shocks and then looking at the effects of these shocks. The analysis of the Great Contraction is perhaps the most famous such analysis. They point to tight monetary policy, so there were interest rate increases in 1928 and 1929, so excessively tight monetary policy as one of the causes of the Great Contraction. They then talk about the failure of the Federal Reserve to prevent massive banking panics throughout the Great Depression, and that turning a garden variety recession into the Great Depression. They point to the dramatic increases in interest rates in the fall of 1931 to defend the dollar when Britain goes off gold as a very contractionary monetary policy shock during a time when the economy is collapsing. And finally, they look at 1936 and 1937 and see very tight policy as a cause of the second round of the Great Depression, the very large recession that occurs in 1937. Now, after the publication of the monetary history, there have been a number of different critiques of the analysis in the monetary history, and kind of from all kinds of angles. So one of the most famous critiques is a critique by Peter Temin, who argues that Friedman and Schwartz overemphasized the importance of money in causing the initial downturn. The basic argument is that if money was tight, interest rates should be high, but actually interest rates were low. Now, from a modern dynamic point of view, this view kind of misses the fact that if you have tight money, you can create very deflationary dynamics, and then even though nominal interest rates are low, real interest rate might be very high. And there's a little bit of controversy about this in the literature, but it seems that real interest rates were very high, so money was tight even though nominal interest rates were low. There's a set of different critiques of the monetary history that has to do with the kind of fairly simplistic view of the transmission mechanism of monetary policy that Friedman and Schwartz had in their analysis. So, for example, there's a string of papers that thinks that Friedman and Schwartz underemphasize the role of banks and credit in the economy. Another string of papers that says that they underestimate the influence of interest rates on the velocity of money and therefore on on the monetary transmission mechanism. Some people go so far as to say that Friedman and Schwartz had no theoretical framework to base their analysis on. Now, it's true that they don't have any equations and they don't formally set down a mathematical framework, but when you read what they're doing, it's pretty clear that what their analysis is grounded in is a fairly simple Keynesian model, a model that has a quantity equation, so MB equals PY kind of equation on the demand side of the economy, and then some kind of Phillips curve on the supply side of the economy. Now, it is true that that model has a very, very simple monetary transmission mechanism. And so some of these critiques have some bite in terms of the analysis being somewhat simple. On the more empirical side, there's a line of critiques that have to do with the timing assumption. So the idea that money, the downturn in money leading the downturn in output being a convincing argument that money caused output, I think in a the modern viewpoint is that wasn't particularly convincing. There's also critiques that there's no econometrics, but then even people that like the fact that they're using the narrative approach have argued that they've applied that approach too informally, that there may have been unconscious bias in the selection of dates and there was no formal method to analyze the effect. So Friedman is famous for saying that there are long and variable lags. If you take that to an extreme, of course, there's kind of like no testable predictions in the whole thing. So you have to kind of maybe be a little bit more formal about that. And then there's the critique, which I think is, from a modern point of view, when you read this stuff today, there is the critique. Are these arguments about the causal effects convincing? There might be confounding factors. So in particular, if you look at the 1937 event, there are some important potential confounding factors like tight fiscal policy and labor strife during that period. Now, I think despite the fact that some of these critiques have bite, it's fair to say that and I'm going to steal a little bit of my discussant's thunder and say that Friedman and Schwartz won the war. So Friedman and Schwartz's argument went from being a very controversial kind of radical view in the 1960s to be a conventional wisdom in the 21st century. And I think Ben Bernanke summed it up pretty well in 2002. He was a governor at the Federal Reserve at the time, and this was at a conference that honored Milton Friedman at his 90th birthday, where he said, "I'd like to say to Milton and Anna, regarding the Great Depression, you're right, we did it, we're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." It's nice that Bernanke got to be, chairman of the Fed when they had to not do it again. So when you look at this whole history, it's kind of interesting from a modern point of view that it looks like monetary history had this wilderness period. Post-Keynes, pre-monetary history, all of a sudden people believed that monetary policy didn't matter. And it really feels like this wilderness period for the whole field of monetary economics. And I think Friedman and Schwartz, in conjunction with what Paul Volcker did at the Federal Reserve, basically brought monetary economics back to life. And it's hard from today's viewpoint to even believe that leading economists in the 40s and 50s thought that monetary policy was not important for inflation, of all things. In addition to that, the word Keynesian economics, when you read this stuff, Keynesian economics means that money doesn't matter in the 1960s. Today, Keynesian economics means that money does matter. So it's extremely jarring to read this literature from the 1960s, such as the influence of the monetary history. Now, I'm almost out of time, and maybe that's a good thing because I'm the very much youngest person in this crowd, and I didn't live this period since 1978 as much as some other people on this panel. Now, the NBER has dramatically changed since 1978. There's much less emphasis on data construction, much more emphasis on conferences, much wider membership of the NBER. What has the influence of the NBER been since 1978? It's a very hard question. What's the counterfactual? Now, I do believe that the influence of the NBER since 1970 has been very large. I don't think there's like a competitive market in these kinds of things, and if the NBER wasn't there, there would probably be a hole where the NBER is at the moment. Just to give you like one sense of the influence of the NBER since 1978, let me flash up some of the papers that have been published in the NBER Macro Annual since it came into being in the 1980s. Now, these are some really, really important papers, okay? So, and I'm just giving you like the top top few. So some of the most important papers in macro and monetary economics have been published by the NBER, even in the post-1978 era. So this is one page worth, this is another page worth. Here's a page worth of books that are very important, especially around the development of the new Keynesian model. Some of these books are really contain key papers that were important in the development of that line of study. But despite that, I think the singular contribution of the NBER to monetary economics is the Friedman and Schwartz project. They created the modern data on monetary aggregates, and they were instrumental in leading monetary economics out of the post-1936 wilderness years that the field experienced.